Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us.
It's great to be here.
Today we're tackling a really tough but important part of American history,
Yeah, a really crucial one, I think.
the Tulsa Race Massacre.
Sometimes called the burning of Black Wall Street.
We're going to try and get to the bottom of not just what happened, but like why it matters so much
Absolutely.
and what we can learn from it, all this time later.
It's a story that a lot of people don't know,
Yeah, it's often overlooked,
for sure.
and it's a story of a community that was thriving and just unimaginable violence.
Unimaginable.
And we're going to be looking at a bunch of different sources, newspaper articles from the time, firsthand accounts from survivors, and then historical analyses that kind of try to piece together everything that happened.
Yeah, trying to make sense of it.
So
Yeah.
what kind of sources are we working with today to kind of get to the bottom of this?
Well, we've got some really powerful firsthand accounts from people who lived through the massacre. And those are really important because they give us a very personal look at the human cost of this event.
Yeah, I bet.
Then we're also looking at newspaper articles from the time, which...
Oh, wow. So we're going right back to 1921.
Exactly.
Wow.
And these articles can be really interesting because they show us how the event was being reported at the time and how the narrative was being shaped.
Oh, that's interesting, especially for this event, because I know that it was kind of covered up for so long.
Exactly. And we can kind of see some of that happening
Oh, wow.
in these early articles.
It's fascinating.
And then finally, we're going to be looking at some historical analyses that try to put the event into context and look at the broader societal forces at play.
So like the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Okay, well, let's dive into that bigger picture then. We
Yeah.
got to set the stage.
Yeah.
It's 1921, and we're in Greenwood, Oklahoma.
A bustling Black community.
They called it Black Wall Street.
And for good reason.
They had all these successful businesses, doctors, lawyers, teachers.
A thriving economy.
They even had a luxury hotel,
Owned by J.B. Stratford.
the largest Black-owned hotel in the entire country at that time.
Incredible.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And we can't forget Dr. A.C. Jackson,
Oh, yeah.
considered one of the most skilled surgeons in America.
Wow, practicing right there in Greenwood.
Right in Greenwood.
This wasn't just a community surviving.
No.
They were excelling,
Absolutely.
which is a stark contrast,
Mhm.
compared to what a lot of other Black communities were facing across the country.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially with things like Jim Crow and sharecropping.
Exactly. This was a community that was thriving despite the odds.
But was that viewed positively by everyone?
That's a great question, and it's a really important one to consider.
It seems like there's always a backlash when any marginalized group starts to gain some power or independence.
You're absolutely right.
So is that the case here?
Well, Greenwood's success was seen as a threat by some in the white community.
Yeah, but
It challenged the existing racial hierarchy and the power dynamics of the time.
so this tension is important to keep in mind as we go through this story.
Absolutely.
So this incident that kind of sparked the violence involved a young Black shoe shiner
Dick Rowland,
and a white elevator operator,
Sarah Page,
and their encounter in the Drexel building elevator.
is shrouded in mystery.
Ooh. Okay, so we don't actually know what happened.
We don't know for sure.
Okay.
There are a lot of different theories out there.
Like what?
Some people say it was a faulty elevator.
Okay, so just an accident.
Just a misunderstanding.
Hmm.
Others believe that Rowland and Page may have known each other.
Okay, so maybe there's a prior relationship?
Possibly.
Okay.
And then there's also a newspaper report that mentions Sarah Page's ripped dress.
Okay, and how is that significant?
Well, that was a common euphemism at the time,
Okay.
and it was heavily implying sexual assault.
Oh, wow.
So it was a very loaded term.
So we have all these different theories,
Right.
and no one really knows for sure what happened.
Uh,
And that just seems like the perfect recipe for rumors and speculation to spread.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, especially when you add in the racial biases of the time.
Exactly.
So what happened next?
Well, the accusation quickly became that Rowland had assaulted Page,
Okay.
and he was arrested.
Oh,
And that's when things really started to escalate.
okay.
A white mob gathered outside the courthouse.
What were they trying to do?
Their intention was clear. They wanted to lynch Dick Rowland.
Oh, wow. So it escalated that quickly.
It did. It was a powder keg waiting to explode.
It's hard to fathom how quickly rumors can lead to violence.
Especially when those rumors are fueled by racial prejudice.
Right, exactly. And this is the Jim Crow South.
Exactly.
So there were already all these racial tensions bubbling under the surface.
Absolutely.
So then what happened?
Well, a group of armed Black men, many of them World War I veterans,
Wow.
arrived at the courthouse to protect Rowland.
Okay, so they were trying to prevent the lynching.
Exactly. They were determined to stand their ground and protect one of their own.
So now we have two armed groups facing off against each other.
Right.
both fueled by fear and anger.
It was an incredibly tense situation.
Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was. So what happened?
Accounts suggest that a single gunshot rang out.
Oh no, where did it come from?
The source of the shot is still debated to this day.
Oh wow.
But that single shot was followed by an exchange of fire,
And then?
and the black men were forced to retreat back to Greenwood.
So that was the start of what was called the riot.
Yeah.
But we know it was a lot more than that.
Riot doesn't even begin to describe the horror of what happened next.
So let's talk about what actually happened.
What began as a tense standoff quickly spiraled into a full-blown massacre.
The Tulsa Race Massacre.
The white mob, joined by police and deputized citizens, descended upon Greenwood.
Oh wow. So it was basically a full-scale attack.
It was.
And what were they using to attack?
They were heavily armed with machine guns and rifles.
And there are even reports of airplanes dropping explosives on Greenwood.
Airplanes. Really?
Yes, eyewitness accounts describe biplanes, likely surplus aircraft from World War I, being used to attack Greenwood from the air.
That's incredible. I mean, it's not something you typically associate with events from this era.
It's a horrifying detail that really highlights the scale and the brutality of the attack.
So this wasn't just a riot. This was a coordinated attack.
It was an act of racial terrorism, calculated and brutal.
And what were they doing during this attack?
The white mob systematically burned homes, businesses, and churches.
Wow.
They looted and pillaged everything in their path.
35 blocks of Greenwood.
Gone.
Reduced to rubble.
It was a devastating loss.
And we were talking earlier about how prosperous this community was.
Yeah.
You know, they had these beautiful homes and businesses.
And it was all destroyed.
Just wiped out.
It's hard to even fathom the scale of the destruction.
And the trauma that must have inflicted on the residents.
Unimaginable.
So what happened to the residents?
While there were instances of self-defense,
Yeah.
the black community was vastly outnumbered and outgunned.
They couldn't stand a chance.
They simply couldn't withstand the onslaught.
So what happened next?
The details are really horrifying.
Yeah.
Black men were dragged from their homes and shot families were separated, and the destruction continued unabated.
And all this was happening while the police were supposed to be protecting them.
Exactly.
Instead, they were participating in the destruction.
The police actively aided the mob, deputized vigilantes, and even provided them with weapons.
So the very people who were supposed to be upholding the law
Yeah.
were actually helping to break it.
It was a complete and utter failure of the justice system.
It's a reminder of how easily institutions can be corrupted and used as tools of oppression.
Absolutely, especially during times of racial tension.
So after the initial violence, did things calm down?
The most intense fighting subsided, but the aftermath was just as devastating.
How so?
The official death toll was recorded as 39, but historians estimate the real number is likely much higher,
Wow, what do they think the real number is?
perhaps in the hundreds.
Wow, so there was a huge discrepancy.
There was a deliberate attempt to downplay the severity of the event
Wow.
and to cover up the true extent of the violence.
So what happened to the survivors?
Thousands were left homeless and destitute.
Wow, and did they get any help?
No, instead, over 6,000 black residents were rounded up and detained for days.
What?
They were accused of instigating a Negro uprising.
A Negro uprising.
There was a blatant attempt to shift blame and justify the violence by portraying the victims as the aggressors.
That's just unbelievable.
It was a tactic used time and again to justify acts of racial violence and oppression.
Wow, and this false narrative was spread through the newspaper.
Exactly.
The official reports.
It shaped public perception for decades.
So basically, they were rewriting history to fit their own agenda.
They were controlling the narrative.
It's incredible how language can be used to distort truth.
It's a powerful tool.
So no one was held accountable.
No, the perpetrators of the massacre faced virtually no consequences.
No charges, no arrests.
Justice was utterly denied.
This just seems to be a recurring theme in American history.
It is
You know, violence followed by impunity.
a tragic pattern.
It's infuriating.
It is.
So we've talked about the massacre itself,
Yes.
but there's still this looming question of what happened to Dick Rowland and Sarah Page.
Yeah.
These two people who were thrust into the center of this horrific event.
It's a mystery.
What happened to them after the massacre?
Well, after the massacre subsided, Sarah Page left town,
Okay.
and she refused to press charges against Dick Rowland.
Okay.
Rowland himself was released,
Okay.
and he vanished.
So they both disappeared.
Their lives after the massacre remain a complete mystery.
That's incredible.
It's as if they were both swallowed whole by the chaos and trauma of that day.
Yeah, their disappearance just adds another layer of intrigue to this story.
It does.
And a lot of unanswered questions.
So many questions.
Like, where did they go?
Right.
What were their lives like after witnessing such unimaginable horror?
Did they ever find peace?
Did they ever find closure?
We just don't know.
Wow, so we've covered a lot of ground here,
We have.
but I feel like we've only scratched the surface.
Absolutely.
The impact of this event goes far beyond those few days in 1921.
It casts a long shadow.
It does, and we're going to get into that
Yes.
when we come back after the break.
We'll delve deeper into the long-term consequences of the massacre and its enduring legacy.
And what lessons we can learn from this dark chapter in American history.
It's a story that we need to keep talking about.
Okay, so we've covered what led up to the massacre,
Yeah.
the violence itself, but the story doesn't end there, right?
Definitely not. The aftermath was just as devastating.
So what happened in the days and weeks after, after the smoke cleared?
I mean, imagine trying to rebuild your life after everything you knew was destroyed.
Yeah, and not just destroyed, like actively burned down by a mob.
Yeah, and on top of that, you're living with the fear that it could happen again.
Right, and the fact that no one was really held accountable.
Yeah, there were no real investigations, no justice for the victims.
And I imagine that made it even harder for the survivors to heal and move on.
Absolutely, the lack of accountability just added insult to injury.
So how did Greenwood recover if it did? Did they get any help rebuilding?
Well, the residents of Greenwood were incredibly resilient. They started rebuilding almost immediately.
Wow, that's amazing.
But they faced a lot of resistance
From who?
from the city government and white residents.
Oh, wow. In what ways?
They were denied building permits. Insurance claims were rejected.
Are you serious?
Yeah, and there were even attempts to rezone Greenwood to prevent its economic resurgence.
So they were basically trying to keep Greenwood from thriving again.
Exactly. It's like they
Yeah.
were trying to erase it from the map.
It's just unbelievable how much they tried to keep the black community down.
It's a clear example of systemic racism.
And how did this impact the black community? In the long term.
Well, the massacre had a devastating impact on Greenwood economically and socially.
Like how?
It wiped out years of hard work and progress. It destroyed businesses and homes.
So it wasn't just a physical attack.
No, it was an attack on black economic success.
And what about the people who lived there? Did they stay?
Many black families were forced to leave. They were traumatized, and they faced limited prospects in Tulsa.
So the massacre scattered the community.
It did.
And those who stayed, did they face any more challenges?
They did. They struggled to rebuild their lives. They faced discrimination in housing, employment, education.
It's just heartbreaking to think about the long-term impact of this event.
It was a horrific event that left deep scars on the community.
So for so long, this story was buried, almost deliberately forgotten.
Right.
Why do you think that is?
Well, there's a tendency in history to silence narratives that challenge the dominant narrative.
Especially when it comes to race and racism.
Exactly. It's uncomfortable to confront these dark chapters in our history.
And it's easier to just pretend they didn't happen.
But we can't afford to do that.
No, we have to learn from our mistakes.
Right. And part of that is acknowledging the truth.
So in the case of Tulsa, there was a conscious effort to suppress the story.
Yeah, records were destroyed, evidence was buried, witnesses were intimidated.
So it was a deliberate cover-up.
It was.
And for a long time, it worked.
It did. The Tulsa Race Massacre remained a hidden wound for decades,
It makes you wonder how many other stories like this are still out there.
waiting to be uncovered.
But in recent years, there's been a growing movement to acknowledge and commemorate the Tulsa Race Massacre.
Yes. There's been a shift in public awareness.
What's driving that shift?
Survivors have started sharing their stories. Historians have uncovered new evidence.
Oh, wow.
Documentaries and films have brought the story to a wider audience.
So the truth is finally coming out.
It is, and it's long overdue.
And what about the efforts to memorialize the victims?
There have been a number of efforts to create memorials and museums. The Greenwood Cultural Center in Tulsa does a great job of preserving the history of Black Wall Street.
That's good.
And the John Hope Franklin Reconciliation Park is a place for reflection and remembrance.
So they're creating spaces where people can learn about what happened.
Exactly.
And what about reparations? Have there been any discussions about that?
There have been calls for reparations to be paid to the descendants of the victims.
To compensate them for the losses their families suffered.
For the generational trauma and the economic losses.
That's a really complex issue.
It is.
But it's an important conversation to have.
It is.
And then there's the question of justice.
Right.
I mean, is it even possible to hold those responsible accountable after all this time?
It's a difficult question.
It is, but it feels like there's a sense of urgency now,
Yeah, there's a feeling that we need to right these historical wrongs,
even if it's symbolic.
to acknowledge the pain and suffering that have been ignored for so long.
So what are the key takeaways from the Tulsa Race Massacre?
I think the most important takeaway is that we can't let this happen again.
Right.
We have to learn from our past.
And what are those lessons?
Well, we have to be aware of the dangers of prejudice and racism,
Of course.
and we have to be vigilant against mob violence.
Then we have to hold our institutions accountable.
Exactly.
Make sure that they're protecting everyone, not just certain groups.
And we have to remember that progress is fragile,
It is.
and we can't take it for granted.
No.
We have to keep fighting for justice and equality,
Absolutely.
and we have to remember the victims of the Tulsa Race Massacre,
Their stories.
their lives.
They're
We can honor their memory by working to create a more just and equitable society.
And by never forgetting what happened in Tulsa in 1921.
Exact.
So we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
From the thriving days of Black Wall Street to the horrors of the massacre and its lasting impact.
It's been a heavy but important conversation.
It has. But before we wrap up, I want to go back to the mystery of Dick Rowland and Sarah Page.
What happened to them after they disappeared?
Right. Their lives after the massacre are still a complete mystery, and I think it's worth taking a moment to think about what might have happened to them.
Sure.
I mean, did they carry the weight of those events, in silence their whole lives?
It's fascinating to think about, the possibilities.
Like, did they ever talk about it?
Yeah, did they ever speak about what they saw, or did they try to bury those memories?
Build new lives completely?
Yeah, we can only speculate.
We've talked about all the historical context.
Yeah.
The big picture of what was going on.
Right.
But their stories, their individual perspectives.
Yeah, those are missing pieces of the puzzle.
It makes you wonder, did they ever connect again after all of that?
That's a great question, and one that a lot of people have wondered about.
I mean, I would imagine at some point, maybe they felt like they had to reach out to each other.
Yeah, maybe seeking solace or understanding.
Or maybe the opposite. Maybe they avoided each other completely.
Could be too painful.
Too much trauma. It's just interesting to think about, how their lives might have unfolded.
Right, the choices they made, the paths they took.
All shaped by this one horrific event.
Absolutely.
And it makes me think about how history, we always focus on the big picture.
Right.
But it's really a collection of all these individual stories.
That's so true.
Each one with its own complexities and nuances.
And we often lose sight of that.
We do. We get caught up in the statistics and the dates and the big events. But we forget that behind those numbers,
Ordinary people
with their own hopes and dreams and fears.
It's easy to forget that.
It is. And the story of the Tulsa Race Massacre, it's not just about the destruction.
No.
It's about the shattering of these individual lives.
Right, the severing of community ties.
The trauma that gets passed down for generations.
The ripple effect is huge.
It is. And I think their disappearance, the fact that we don't have any closure, just adds another layer of tragedy to this story.
It's like their voices were silenced, their experiences were lost.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to keep asking these questions.
Absolutely.
To keep searching for those missing pieces.
Trying to get a complete understanding.
To understand the true human cost of what happened.
And to honor the memory of the victims.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Tulsa Race Massacre, what are some final thoughts for our listeners?
I think the most important takeaway is that we can't forget what happened.
Right, we have to remember.
We have to remember the lives that were lost, the community that was destroyed, the injustices that were perpetrated.
This isn't just some event from the past.
No, it's still relevant today.
It is a reminder that the fight for racial justice is far from over.
Absolutely.
And that we have to be vigilant against all forms of prejudice and discrimination.
We can't let history repeat itself.
So what can we do?
I think we all need to ask ourselves what we can do in our own lives.
Yeah.
In our own community to challenge racism and promote equality.
It's a call to action.
It is.
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure.
For sharing your expertise.
It's an important story to tell.
It is. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
We hope you learned something.
We hope it was thought-provoking.
And we encourage you to keep learning about the Tulsa Race Massacre.
Its impact and its legacy.
It's a story that deserves to be told.
And remembered.
Absolutely.
So thanks again for listening.
And we'll see you next time.